Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 54 and 55. Let's begin. The next time Hisashi awoke, he could feel rage bubbling in his mind. How dare that buffoon injure him? The drugs were receding and he could feel the way the skin on his head was pulled taut. He wanted to touch the flesh, but he could feel a variety of needles in his arm. He did not wish to dislodge them. Plus the ventilator was still hissing, and if the damage had been that bad, he wasn't sure how the doctor would have hooked it up. The room was silent, save for the hiss of the ventilator, the beep of the heart monitor and Gigantamachia's breathing. Beyond that there was silence. All for One reached out with a quirk to confirm it. He could feel several life forms but recognized them as Garaki's experiments. Kurogiri was nowhere close, but neither was Tomura, so that was acceptable. He felt Izuku though, reasonably close, and to his senses his son had too many quirks. Garaki had some explaining to do. The man had indicated that they had gotten a regeneration quirk, but surely they hadn't had Izuku grab every quirk he'd come into contact with? No. There had to be another reason. Hisashi timed his breathing with the ventilator, willing himself to take a deep breath. He needed to think. He needed to work through his emotions. Most would say he was a passionate man, but he seldom acted on passion alone. He hadn't survived this long by being ruled by emotion. He controlled them, even if they were negative. Even if he didn't like them, and he had a feeling once he knew the extent of his injuries he would be very, very angry and emotional. He thought about what Kyudai had said. Head injury. Extensive brain damage. Skull and brain destroyed with several lobes gone. And that was a summary. Hisashi thought about what he knew. Even with a limited understanding of biology, he knew he shouldn't have woken up. It was not in his nature to be overly positive, but he suspected that waking up was something he should be positive about, regardless of his situation now. He tried to feel his body. Hisashi knew from experience that it wasn't as easy as simply thinking about it. He'd seen often enough with others that phantom limbs were a thing. He tried wriggling his toes. He felt the sheet against them, so that was good. He formed both hands into fists, and again, felt the sheets. So he had all his limbs. So the damage was, as the doctor said, to his head. He tried again to open his eyes, and once more the skin stretched, but there was no movement. He tried to twitch his nose but could feel nothing. With the face mask, he should have felt that. Hisashi swallowed, and once again he saw the powered fist coming at him. He knew what damage that would do. He tried to take a deep breath again, this time going against the ventilator, which caused him to cough. The lack of pain from his body was reassuring, but he couldn't feel his hair. Head injury. All for One could foresee scarring. Probably extensive scarring. What did that change? Nothing. He still wanted his brother's quirk back. He still wanted society to bow before him. But his injuries might change his ability to work on that. He would have to find out exactly how bad the damage was. The fact that he was still on a ventilator, even after having a regeneration quirk, told him it was bad. And the fact he couldn't open his eyes. The doctor would have told him if there was tape over them, or if he'd had to close them. That meant the damage there was harsher. So, he was blind. And he had probably lost his sense of smell, Hisashi realized. He hadn't smelt the antiseptic. He'd tasted it. So 2 senses down. Smell wasn't that big a deal. He didn't rely on that. Sight was more problematic. But there were other ways to see. There were quirks that allowed one to see in the dark, and some of them did not actually rely on having functional eyeballs. He'd seen people use them with their eyes closed. And there were radar quirks, ultraviolet quirks, there were other ways to see. He'd have to get one, or a few. Hisashi pushed the damage he'd suffered out of his mind. He would discover that when he could, and it didn't change his desires. It just changed how he went about them. He felt his lips move. He had felt his son earlier. Tomura was no doubt with Kurogiri. He'd been raising them to be his lieutenants, but perhaps they would have to step up. He would still control the overall goal, but in time, they would become the new faces, the new frontmen. The world might even believe they'd taken over from him. That wasn't much of a shift. Hisashi nodded. He could accept that. If there was no way to heal, the doctor would no doubt have done his best. Gigantamachia would have seen to that, but with him now conscious, there were other options. If things couldn't change with his injuries, then there were still options, and if things could change, then nothing had changed. Hisashi tracked the doctor's movements with his hearing. He'd woken up to find the doctor present. The man hadn't noticed that he was awake. Gah! He'd noticed now. Hisashi, please don't do that, Kyudai muttered. My hearing has not been damaged, All for One managed to say. His voice was still dry and weak, but the statement was enough. Directionally, you will have issues, the doctor countered. Your outer ear was destroyed, and while I believe the middle and inner ear have regenerated, the outer ear has not been regenerated. I can hear well enough, Hisashi said. He'd already thought about what had happened, and while there were options, he sensed he had to get stronger first. Why does Izuku have that many quirks? He got the question out, ignoring how his mouth was dry. The doctor didn't answer. Instead, Hisashi heard him come closer and there was a rustle of plastic before the temperature changed. We've got a shroud over you, came the explanation, but it did not answer his question. Kyudai made sure to put his hand on Hisashi's forearm and All for One heard the slosh of water. For your throat, Garaki indicated. Izuku, Hisashi reminded the man of the question. He pushed aside his displeasure at being waited upon. In a restaurant, he didn't mind. In this situation, he did not like to be reminded of weakness. The doctor sighed and Hisashi knew the man was weighing up what to tell him. He thought he'd broken the doctor of that habit. When we brought you back, we weren't sure if you were alive. With the damage, your body was breathing, but I didn't know if your mind was still there. We had Izuku check if your quirks were present. And they were. Hisashi remained silent as he took in the explanation. It made some sense, but it did not tell him why Izuku had too many quirks. One time Izuku checked, he got too close, and you pushed the quirks into him, the doctor finished. It was an unconscious action on your part, and Izuku is adapting. How long? Hisashi asked. How long had it been since he'd done that to Izuku? How long had it been since his fight with his brother's current successor? He hadn't asked because as an immortal, time was simply something that was. That was 3 days ago. Bring Izuku here, he instructed. He would sort out what quirks his son had and take back those Izuku didn't need. Also search the quirk registries. I'm going to need something to assist with sight. Gigantomachia, could you bring Izuku? The doctor asked. Hisashi felt a flash of amusement. Kyudai had no doubt learned the hard way that he couldn't order the giant if Gigantomachia thought it was against his primary orders. Even so, he heard his bodyguard move. I will bring the little lord. Thanks to the regeneration quirk, you shouldn't need much rehabilitation, Garaki told him. Who found it? Hisashi asked. They had been attempting to get regeneration into Kyudai's creations and they had searched quirk registries for them. Izuku did actually, the doctor told him. He went with Tomura to collect it. He is compromised? All for One demanded. No, Kurogiri made sure of that. That was something. If I am still injured, it does not seem to be a good regeneration quirk. It's a very good quirk. The problem is that it took your injuries as a template, the doctor explained. Hisashi wasn't sure what to say to that and he was saved from having to when he heard Gigantomachia return. Izuku was quiet. He's unconscious. Kyudai told him. Bring him here, Hisashi instructed, vaguely waving one hand. It felt heavy. That wasn't something he'd encountered often before, but in his life, All for One had been sick. Not often, but he had lived through chemical attacks and various pandemics. He'd survived them all, but he knew what it took to recover. The heaviness of his limbs told him he would have to spend time recovering now. Gigantomachia came forward and after a moment, Hisashi felt Izuku's curls. He just let his fingers run through them for a little while. They were soft. It was nice. Then he reached out with All for One. He felt Izuku's quirk. As always, it seemed to glare at him, but it was hard to feel it, given it was surrounded by other quirks. Hisashi gently tugged at them, identifying the quirks that he'd apparently put into his son. He could just take them all back, but instead of that, he tried to think of what quirks Izuku might need, which would complement those he already had. He would need to copy some quirks. The more useful ones. He took back several, which he would have to make sure Izuku could get back. Shock absorption was definitely one he should have given to Izuku a while back. He left his son with a few change quirks. They would be useful for Izuku to hide his true form. Maybe not now, while he's 9, but later. All for One always planned for the long term. He pulled back several quirks from his son and then reached out to take the others. Even injured, he was trying to be gentle since this was Izuku. Hisashi settled each quirk back into his body, but at the last few he encountered resistance. There was a mental hiss. The glare from Izuku's quirk seemed to intensify. All for One looked at its progeny. The quirk seemed to glow back. And while Hisashi didn't exactly see with All for One, it appeared as if Izuku's quirk was now crouching over two of the quirks that he wanted to take back. It was ignoring the small change quirks Hisashi had left. It was very clear that the quirk was saying, "Mine." Mentally, All for One snorted with amusement and then backed off from those quirks. They weren't major quirks, but they did fit the dragon theme he had been developing for Izuku. Poison Fang would give Izuku a weapon, and Night Cat would allow him to see in the dark, while splitting his pupils like a cat. If Hisashi was honest with himself, that quirk was useless to him now, so it wasn't a concern to leave it with his son. Hisashi nodded and ruffled his son's hair. "Leave him here," All for One said to Gigantomachia, trusting the large man to be gentle with his son. A weight was placed in the bed beside him and he heard his bodyguard move away. Hisashi shifted slightly, placing one hand on his son's shoulder. His pajamas felt warm. "I have most of the quirks," he told Gigantomachia and Kyudai. "Not all?" Garaki asked. Izuku's quirk wanted to keep some. He could imagine the way Kyudai would look at that. Quirks weren't sentient, but if you knew enough about them, then it became clear that they weren't just passive either. Izuku's quirk came from All for One. It was no surprise that it craved other quirks for its master. Hisashi leaned back. He felt tired, but he pushed through it. He was awake now, and so it was time to head to recovery, and to adjusting his plans. The first thing there was to accelerate some of his plans. He always planned for his son to have more quirks than just those related to his dragon theme, and now was the time to ensure he had them. And regeneration would be good for the prototypes. He turned his head to where he thought the doctor was. "I need you to start the process." All for One couldn't see, but he imagined he knew the way the Garaki would have stiffened. "Are you sure?" The question was oddly soft. "I am sure," Hisashi replied as firmly as he could. "How many?" Internally, All for One began counting. 3 for regeneration. 3 for shock absorption. 3 for increased strength. "At least 10, he said finally. "For this round." 10? There was no need for him to imagine the way Garaki was shocked. "I will endure," Hisashi reassured him. The doctor was silent. Hisashi knew why. The process was a procedure he'd developed to copy quirks. In theory it was simple. Garaki grew human cell cultures, and when they were large enough, Hisashi gave the culture a quirk. They were human cells, so they could carry a quirk. They weren't alive. It was just flesh. Then the culture was split and grown further. The quirk was thus duplicated. Hisashi took back the quirk and then transferred the second one to a prototype. The original plan had called for the cell culture to be incorporated into the prototype. That had happened once. It would not happen again. In theory, there was no pain to Hisashi. In practice, each time a quirk was copied, it was agony. After all, Kyudai used his cells for it. And somehow, he could feel it. Distance didn't make a difference. He could feel the abnormality, and the pain didn't end until the culture was destroyed. And then he felt like he'd lost a limb for the next week. It wasn't a pleasant experience. But Izuku needed those quirks. And so did the prototypes. And he did as well. Therefore there needed to be 3 copies of them. And Hisashi knew there would be more quirks later that had to be copied. But for now, giving Izuku regeneration, shock absorption and increased strength would be a good base. The prototype would also benefit. And he knew from experience that he was going to be a while recovering. If he was going to go through the discomfort of the process, he might as well do it at a time when he wasn't going to be as productive as normal anyway. "I'll get started," Kyudai agreed. He knew better than to argue, but Hisashi thought he would want to see the results as well. "Find me someone with a non-eye-based sight quirk first," All for One gave the instruction. "I'm already searching the registry," Garaki informed him. "Good," Hisashi said, before he lay back. He kept his hand on Izuku's shoulder, taking comfort from the warmth of his son beside him. He was injured. He was weakened. But he was not dead. That's all that mattered. He would work with this. Society would know his wrath. It would just be a little less direct, and All for One had long ago realized that the outcome was important, not the means. His injuries were a setback. But they were not the end. "Please, give it back." It was times like this that All for One almost wished his hearing had been damaged. Instead, he ignored the begging and activated his new quirk. Immediately the world opened around him. He looked around, silently marveling at the details and the differences. Even with quirks, humans were reliant on their sight. He had been adapting to the darkness, but he much preferred being able to see. It wasn't the same as normal vision, but it was infinitely better than the darkness. He could see the outline of various objects in the room. He turned his features to the woman who was begging. Gigantomachia was holding her and they were both outlined in light. Almost like a heat haze. He could see features on them though, enough to determine who was who beyond the sheer size difference. "Thank you, my dear," he told her. It wasn't often that people remained conscious through him extracting their quirk, not unless he was very careful, but it did happen. "Give it back," she gasped. "Sensei will use it better than you," Tomura told the woman. She didn't appear to hear him and didn't shift her gaze. "Tomura, All for One," said the teen's name softly. It was an instruction. The gray-haired teen looked at him. Hisashi met his gaze with his new quirk and nodded. Tomura grinned and then reached out. Gigantomachia knew what to do, and he held the woman out. "I'd usually offer you some form of compensation," All for One told the woman. "But I'm afraid at the moment, secrecy must take precedence. I will, however, assure you that this won't hurt for long." She was paying attention to him, and with his new quirk, Hisashi could see her eyes move. "What?" By then it was too late. Tomura was there and he gently lay his hand on her arm. The woman stiffened and then she screamed as the skin on her arm flaked and then disintegrated. The disintegration moved up her arm. She continued screaming before the dust moved into her chest and that, thankfully, shut her up. Her eyes continued to scream and her mouth worked until the dust claimed her face. Then, there was a puff, like a hydraulic releasing before with a whisper of sound what was left of her collapsed. "You are getting faster, Tomura," All for One noted. The teen grinned. "I should have grabbed her upper arm." A tilt of his head relayed his question. "She would have shut up quicker," the gray-haired teen told him. Hisashi nodded. "Is her quirk good?" Tomura asked. "It is remarkably serviceable," All for One confirmed. Tomura was silent for a few moments. "You shouldn't need it," he hissed. There was nothing Hisashi could say to that. He hadn't expected the current holder of One for All to be that strong, but now that he knew what he had to do. "I'll kill him," Tomura growled. Hisashi gave the teen a smile. "You must do what you think is best," he told him. "I'll kill him. I want him dead. He shouldn't have done that to you." "Then I will assist you," All for One said. "I will always assist you, Tomura," he reassured the teen. He'd intended Tomura and Izuku to be his lieutenants, but there had always been movement in his plans. Now the two of them would be more public. He always worked in the shadows, but the original plan had been for the two boys to be his support. People would know they were connected to him in the shadowy way that people knew he existed. Now, people would assume that they were the ones making the decisions. And insofar as was possible, they would be making the decisions but with his guidance. It was a subtle difference but an important one. "You have done well," he continued. The unexpected praise cut through the teen's muttering. "Working with Izuku," All for One explained, "to fetch that quirk." "It didn't work," Tomura said. Looking anywhere but at him. "It did," Hisashi objected. He'd gone over this with Garaki and he expected he'd have to go over it with Izuku as well. Tomura was practice. "The doctor assures me that without the quirk, I would still be unconscious." The gray-haired teen thought about that for a few moments. "Why did you let it happen?" Tomura demanded. That was a delicate question. He hadn't exactly let anything happen. As galling as it was to admit the current holder of One for All was stronger than expected. He would deal with that. He could have already dealt with the buffoon. Poison would work on the number one hero, but that would not give him the opportunity to get his brother's quirk back. And that was a good reason to tell the teen. "All Might has something I want," Hisashi said softly. "What?" All for One sighed. He'd never explained his history to Tomura. "Do you know what All Might's quirk is called?" he asked. He saw Nana Shimura's grandson consider it. Izuku would probably have been able to tell him immediately that the number one hero never answered questions about his quirk. "No," Tomura growled finally, obviously losing patience. "His quirk is named One for All." Tomura was intelligent. He saw the connection, but he didn't know what the connection was. "Not exactly." Once upon a time, there were two brothers, Hisashi said. They were born when quirks weren't even called quirks. The elder had a quirk, and the younger one didn't. He explained. His words got the teen's attention and Tomura looked at him as he spoke. The younger was also sickly and so was often left at home to fend for himself. The elder was a leader of men. He led those with power and those with vision. He fought against those who would kill those with power, those who didn't realize that the power of a quirk was the future, but he loved his brother. He was doing it for his brother, so that there was a place for everyone in the world. And because his brother was weak, and needed strength, he gave his brother a quirk. One for all, Tomura made the connection. No, all for one corrected. The quirk was a stockpiling quirk. It allowed the user to stockpile strength. It was meant to give the younger brother strength, to heal him. It was meant to help him. Unbeknownst to them all though, the younger brother did have a quirk. The younger brother's quirk allowed him to transfer his own quirk to someone else. The elder continued to fight until one day, he faced his brother across the field. Hisashi didn't say anything further. He didn't need to. He knew what happened and he didn't need to remember again. So, Tomura drew the word out. All Might has my brother's quirk. I want it back, Hisashi told him. It was an explanation as to why he couldn't just kill the number one hero. Of course, it didn't explain why he hadn't done more to capture the man. I'm still going to kill him, Tomura growled. Hisashi nodded. It will be easier to do if you continue to work with Izuku, he indicated. TCH, the teen rolled his eyes. You baby him. He is only 9. At least he doesn't want to be a hero anymore, the gray-haired teen told him. Izuku will continue to improve, as will you. But you are both still too young to take center stage. I don't need him. Hisashi leveled his now sightless gaze at the teen. Izuku will seldom be in your party, and when he is, it will be for support, he reminded Tomura of what he had told the boy soon after Izuku had come to live with him. That hasn't changed, Tomura. I still need both of you. He had some good ideas, Tomura said softly. It definitely sounded like he didn't want to admit that. All for One didn't smile. Give him time, he instead urged, nodding slightly at the teen. That was all he could say. He'd learned long ago that if he pointed out that Tomura hadn't been better at that age, then he'd only get ignored. It is time to go, Tomura Shigaraki, Kurogiri interrupted before Tomura could reply. Hisashi nodded and Kurogiri expanded into a portal. Tomura looked at him and then went through the Misty Man. All for One released the vision quirk he'd just taken, actually enjoying the darkness that surrounded him. Tomura was at a difficult age. He still hated heroes, but Hisashi was wise enough to realize that his injuries would make the boy doubt. At the moment, that doubt was covered with anger, but it could change. If it did and Tomura turned against him, well, he would handle that. And if Tomura drowned in rage and attacked someone, again, he would deal with that. He pushed the boy from his mind and timed his breathing with the ventilator to take several considered breaths as he shifted his thoughts. And made new plans. Options were always good to have, but Tomura was not someone who dominated his thoughts. Instead, his mind lingered on his son, and on the path forward. But the path forward started with knowledge of the past. Now that he was recovering, he had to find out how All Might had found him. He knew he'd injured the number one hero, but the news hadn't said anything about him dying, so he too was most likely recovering. Even so, Hisashi was not in any shape to hold off a hero raid. No matter how many he killed, there were always more. Gigantomachia, Hisashi called. My lord? Bring Izuku to me, he ordered. He didn't need to activate the quirk to know that the huge man wasn't entirely pleased with the order. Gigantomachia didn't want to leave him alone, but at least he recognized that he was in a secure environment. Yes, my lord. He heard the giant leave and a few moments later, there was a happy squeal. Daddy. All for One smiled brightly and activated the sight quirk. Little dragon. Izuku ran up to him but then paused. You just have to be careful, Hisashi told his son, opening his arms. He saw Izuku nod and then felt his son carefully climb into his lap. He gave Izuku a hug, twisting slightly so that he could feel Izuku's curls. It was a bit of a shock when Izuku began crying. He didn't cry softly either. It was great, heaving sobs. Little dragon? Hisashi asked his son. Usually he knew what Izuku was crying about, but this time he had no idea. There was a series of sniffles and deep breaths. I was so scared. Izuku eventually wailed. Ah, that made sense. So was I, Hisashi sort of whispered into Izuku's hair. He hadn't been scared. He'd been unconscious, but it was probably better for his son to figure that out on his own. You were? Izuku didn't try to escape his embrace, but All for One could tell he was surprised. I was afraid I wouldn't see you again, he explained. That caused his son to hug him harder, and he continued sobbing. Hisashi felt like he was getting a bath, but he was prepared to indulge Izuku. You did well, you know, little dragon, he said eventually. Izuku sniffed. How? He managed to ask. The quirk, All for One told his son. Without it, I would still be unconscious. But, Izuku shifted into Hisashi's new quirk. He could see the way his son was looking directly at him. It was different from Tomura, who kept trying to look away. Izuku was prepared to see what had happened. The doctor explained it to you. Hisashi reminded him. That got him a small nod, and Izuku's chin dug into his stomach. He wasn't lying, my little dragon. I did need that quirk. But it didn't work. Izuku managed to get his objection out. It worked well enough, All for One assured his son. It should have been perfect. So that was it. Quirks have limitations, he explained. Each quirk has a drawback that you have to understand. Unbeknownst to All for One, he had just confirmed in his son's mind that quirks could not be relied upon. Will you give it back? Izuku asked. His little dragon didn't know Tomura had taken care of the woman. Of course I will, Hisashi told his son. When I am fully better. I will give the quirk back and some more compensation. Izuku smiled at him. Thank you, Daddy, I couldn't explain it to her. There was no opportunity. I know you only wanted the best, and while it wasn't perfect, it might be fixable. Izuku gasped. How? All for One leaned down slightly, as if to brush his now non-existent nose against Izuku's. The doctor told you that healing quirks are registered with the government, he stated, but got a nod from Izuku. And that they are used on heroes who work for the Hero Public Safety Commission? Another nod. Well, I have government contacts, Hisashi said conspiratorially to his son. He couldn't see Izuku's green eyes exactly, but he knew that they widened as his son worked through the implications. He heard his breath catch. Dr. Garaki couldn't use them, he told his son. He suspected he couldn't use them either. Healing quirks were good, but he didn't think they were that good. Maybe in a few more generations, but not now. But it would give Izuku hope, and he sensed his son needed that. What, my little dragon? How do you have government contacts? That was a question that made sense. Everything Izuku had heard to date was about how the government wasn't good. Those I help sometimes go into government, he explained. They went into government because that was the price of a quirk, and he made sure they succeeded. And then they help me out when they can, he added. But my little dragon, do you remember what I told you previously? Hisashi asked. He needed to speak to his government contacts anyway. They would be able to tell him how the #1 hero had found him and what other fallout there had been from the battle. He had watched the news, but there were definitely things not being said, and while he was good at filling in the blanks, there was such a thing as too much silence. But he was aware that there was a possibility that someone had betrayed him. All for One watched Izuku with his new quirk. He could see that his son's brow was furrowed as he thought. There's no bad quirks? He chuckled at the response. Not that. Think about what I told you soon after you first went to school, he prompted. Izuku kept thinking, but it was a message that All for One was sure his son knew so much that he didn't even think about it. Family, he prompted. Oh! Izuku exclaimed. Family you can trust. Family will not betray you, he recited with a remarkable show of memory. Hisashi was honestly surprised, but pleased that his son remembered, though if his child was remembering everything so perfectly that might cause some issues, depending on his morals. Those were about to be tested, so it was a thought for another day. Very good. So now, apply that thought to my government contacts, he instructed. His son gasped. All for One could hear the outrage in the sound. There will be consequences if they do, he assured Izuku. I want you here when I call them. He added. Why? Because there are things you can't learn in school and you are old enough to start learning them. Like Tomura? It was a reasonable inference. A little bit and you will continue your self-defense lessons with Kurogiri, but I will be teaching you other things. Izuku frowned at that. All for One didn't see it as much as feel it. Does that mean I'm not going back to school? He asked. Hisashi wasn't sure if his son was disappointed or happy about that. You will go back to school, he decided. There were valuable lessons to be learned there, but one of the reasons for talking to his contacts was to ensure that Izuku hadn't been found. But you will also have lessons with me. Izuku didn't say anything at that. Instead, All for One felt his son's arms tighten around him as he trembled. Hisashi raised one hand, and laid it on Izuku's head, stroking his hair. He deactivated the sight quirk and sat there, enjoying the presence of his son. It was okay for now. Just for a while. End chapters 54 and 55, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Author note: I think that might be the first time All for One has actually fully lied to Izuku. The rest of it has been inference, omission, or highlighting facts that support you while dismissing others. But if Izuku works out that the woman is dead, All for One will probably tell him that he didn't know that Tomura had killed her and that is chastised Tomura for it. Then he'd probably tell Tomura to work on his acting and pretend to be sorry. For a day or so. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.